Millions of children are educated every day in a myriad of settings. Homeschool, public school, private school, charter schools, online academies, learning pods, private tutoring, and more. Why are so many families transitioning to homeschooling? What advantages have they found? What unique challenges do they face? What have they learned, and how can listening to their experiences support your child's education? These are their stories. Together, we learn. This is the Edvantage. Hello, fellow educators, and thank you for listening. I'm Todd Michael, creator and host of the Edvantage. Today's guest is Brett Veinotte. Brett's career in and around institutionalized schooling ran from 2000 until 2013. During that time, he experienced a wide variety of academic settings, professional roles, and disturbing revelations. Brett began working as a counselor and outdoor educator at a boarding school in Vermont in 2000, and was eventually promoted to lead teacher of a specialized campus. He then taught at a private day school in Manchester, Vermont from 2004 to 2006, where he designed new curricula for all classes he taught, including American history, world history, media ethics, film history, and a variety of mathematics courses. After leaving classroom teaching in 2006, Brett began to work exclusively as a private tutor in the greater Boston area. Much of his work related to standardized test prep, but also included college application and admission consulting, leading training sessions for prospective teachers planning to take state certification exams, and serving as a liaison between parents and public schools to address student needs and parent concerns. More recently, while growing the School Sucks podcast, he served as the vice president of a tutoring and educational consulting company in New Hampshire. I hope you enjoy the interview. Brett Veinotte, thank you so much for coming on The Edvantage. Welcome.
It is great to be here with you, Todd. I actually just started listening to your first episode, and I'm very envious. I always wanted to have my mom on my show. Your first guest is your mom. I thought that was great, and we just never got around to it before I wrapped the podcast up last year. But she was a teacher. She taught until around the time I was born. And one of my favorite stories that I actually learned recently is she was teaching and she hated it. She was in right outside Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And she said, boy, how am I going to get out of teaching? And decided that getting pregnant was the way to do it. And, that brought me into this world. So it was my mother's dissatisfaction with school that led to my existence. What a story.
How poetic. That is, I can't think of a more fitting origin story. So
yeah, she told me that on vacation a couple years ago. I was like, no way.
Oh, and that's even better, finding out after the fact, so that you didn't even have an influence on the work you do. That's even better. So how did that impact her approach to your education? What was your education experience like?
It was, I would say, good compared to most. I grew up in a pretty tight-knit community in New Hampshire. Both my parents were involved. I had a lot of friends, parents of friends all knew each other. So the environment around the school, and obviously the school was the place that everybody kind of converged around the children and the needs of the children. So my dad was actually the chairman of the school board when I was in elementary school, and he had some controversial and outlandish ideas like teachers should be paid based on merit. And that made him unpopular, and that made me kind of unpopular with many of the teachers in the school because of we shared a last name. But, my parents were involved in a way that I think was reasonable before like helicopter parenting was a thing. They were present, they were attentive, and, my school experience was certainly not terrible. It wasn't until I got to middle school where things really went off the rails. So middle school, high school, I saw college as a great opportunity to actually learn some things about myself. And encounter some of the right professors to believe in myself more as a thinker.
Right.
So there is plenty of good with the bad, and I always just try to remember that I probably had it better than most people who go through K through 12 schooling in the United States and certainly around the world.
Sure. And I think, the fact that your parents both had that awareness, I'm sure played a lot into that because, we all have to find out for ourselves, kind of wake up from the matrix in our own way and at our own time. But having parents that aren't just completely dedicated to the system and worshiping the system in the form that it is certainly would help. Because if nothing else, seeing kind of that pushback that your dad got from your teachers and kind of even just being aware that there were other ideas, other options, it kind of helps you realize, oh, so the way that I've experienced isn't the only way. And I think that's missing in so many families where it's, to even suggest that we could have a different system of pay or of, teacher to student ratio or just any of these things that aren't really that revolutionary. They're only revolutionary if you have a couple hundred years version of history and you're not looking at any other countries or any other periods of time. People just kind of recoil because they're like, well, this is all I've ever known. This is how we've always done it. This is how it was when I was a kid. Why wouldn't I do it with my own?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, my parents are boomers, so they are like that, with a lot of things like out there in the world, like, oh, this is the way that you do this. This is how you address this. Not to apply labels to a whole generation, but one thing that I've noticed about them is that there is a kind of, I wouldn't say they were overly obedient, but there was a kind of obeisance to the way this is how things work. These are the procedures that you follow. This is the person that you write a letter to if things aren't going your way at the state house or whatever. And a little bit of naivete. And I was actually just talking with my dad about this current project that I'm working on for School Sucks. And he's like, yeah, the schools just aren't doing what they're supposed to do. And I was like, "Oh, Dad, I think they are. I think they do great." And this is something that we'll get into. I think,
right.
They're extremely effective if you know their telos, if you know their purpose. They're pretty much right on track in a lot of ways. If the priority is the education of young people versus the schooling of young people, then I could see why you'd be upset. So he and I got into this whole conversation about like, well, we should just look at where they do it well. And, he started pointing towards Japan. And this has been a thing since like the 80s that, they drill and kill, the kids get good grades, it creates great career opportunities. But that's really like an isolated look at what school is supposed to be, or what education is supposed to be, right? So education equals school, which is, I think, the first huge mistake that a lot of people make. I've said throughout the run of my show, School Sucks, that these things have more of an opposite relationship than being synonyms, school and education. So if education is more child-centered and holistic, and just because you have schools in South Korea or Japan, I'm sure the same is true in China, where people are following the rules and performing well according to the authorities in the school. Right. Yeah, that's what makes school great. I'm sure those schools are great, but that has little to do with the education and healthy development of children.
Yeah, and that's such a great point. And I'm curious what, for you, when that awareness started to happen, because a lot of people who do go through more traditional school settings, it has to happen a little later. I myself was homeschooled, so I kind of already started out with this healthy, distrust of the system. And one of the big reasons why I decided to go into education as an educator myself and, get my degree and my teaching credential and all of these things was, well, I'm going to go in and I'm going to help the system become better. I'm going to help change the system, because I had that same mindset that you're alluding to of like thinking that their goal is to educate. And so assuming, well, it's just they're failing at that job they're trying to do. I'm going to help them figure out how to do it better because I can see from the outside how they could do it better. And it wasn't until I kind of just got into the nitty gritty of it to realize exactly what you're saying, that it's a very well-oiled machine, and it's designed to do exactly what it's doing. And most of the key players that your child will ever have contact with are, for all intents and purposes, unaware of that purpose. I mean, most teachers and administrators, and even at the district level, a lot of people think that it is the education is the goal. And so that's what makes it so effective, is that kind of the boots on the ground carrying out the orders are insulated enough from those giving the orders and designing the structure that there's a lack of awareness. So I'm curious where you started to see that, started to wake up to it, and recognize that, hey, this is not what everyone thinks it is, and I'm going to call a spade a spade.
Yeah, I think I could have seen it all along the way if I had the wisdom to be more attuned, to the realities of my environment. Like
Mm-hmm.
starting with teachers in elementary school didn't like me because my dad wanted their pay to be linked to their performance. Now, that doesn't mean that teachers are bad and spiteful people, but it is like a lot of well-trained professions. There is, a strong tendency towards obedience and conformity, especially if you have like a public sector union tied to it, where, everybody's like this, this is our script, this is our song sheet. So
Yeah,
it was
yeah.
very easy for people who maybe weren't thinking too hard about what was being proposed in the school board meetings in this little New Hampshire town 35 years ago, to just attach a kind of antagonism to that. So that would have been the first thing. I mean, the second thing, with more self-knowledge, I could have understood that day after day, the environment, because I didn't perform well, or I didn't perform up to the expectations of authorities, I was internalizing this idea that something was wrong with me, that I was defective, that, this is a kind of system or machinery that has been well-oiled and functioning a long time before you came along, Brett Veinotte. And if you are polite and you behave, you will be allowed to join it. But nothing is wrong with it. If you don't fit in, something's wrong with you. And I think that is implied in the school environment all the way through 12th grade for most people, and that extends out into society. We have terms like maladjusted,
Right, right.
and there's a great quote, I think it's by this kind of mystic named Kishmirti, where there's no, I'm totally extremely loosely paraphrasing at this point, but there's no, great benefit to being to being well adjusted to a sick society.
Right.
And schooling in many ways is a kind of sick society. Thank you for bearing with me. I struggled through that.
No, the sentiment is there. I got you.
So I think I'm trying to just jog my memory about what else it was like. Maybe middle school is just torture. It is absolutely, it doesn't seem like there's any like light at the end of the tunnel during that period. And then I think, we start to get some empowerment in high school, where even though we have adults that are still telling us we're children and treating us like children, we can have a girlfriend, we can get a part-time job, we can get our driver's license, and we start to feel like adults. So high school, even though it could be, more rigorous in a lot of ways, has more hope for most people than I think the middle school experience does.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that sticks out is when I was a freshman in high school, I did this through all 4 years of high school, there was a newspaper class where, it was a period, just like one of the periods of the school day, but we would go and we would work. And it's very like, you're up and out of your seat, you're interacting with people socially, you're solving problems, you're producing something that is going to actually like show up and have an impact in the physical world. And one thing that I noticed, certainly in retrospect, but I think I even noticed it at the time, was that this experience in my so-called education was completely alien from everything else that was happening during the school day. To do something purposeful and productive and social was like what recess had been, in elementary school. But this was just one of my classes. And I think when I look back at that experience, when I actually became a teacher, it's like, why wouldn't school be more like that if the purpose was education, like getting kids excited and intrinsically motivated about doing things that they can actually, see that there is purpose in? almost none of the work that we're given from grade 1 through 12 has any of that opportunity built into it. So I think that was like, if I'm just reflecting on my school experience, maybe those are things that I should have noticed, that I wish I had had the language to explain to myself or others at the time. But yeah, I think it was like, I was really inspired by one professor that I had in college, and I said, well, I'm going to go be a teacher, which if I had told anybody, from my high school that like in 6 years I'll be teaching history, certainly they would have laughed at me. But I graduated from college in 2000 with a communications degree, and my minor was history. So I went back to school. I got into a master's program and a teacher certification program, and then I started, student teaching and working as first a TA, a teacher's assistant, and then somehow, because I worked at a private school, I wound up running a whole program for like a special needs campus on this school when I was 24 years old. So now I'm in charge. I'm in charge of the so-called education of these young people. And I think that, coupled with the experience in higher education, being around people like in the master's program, people who are already teaching in states like New York and Massachusetts, because this was in Western Massachusetts where I was going to school. So you're close to Vermont, you're close to New York, you're close to Massachusetts, and you have all these people coming into this graduate program, and it is basically like a support group. This is also around the time No Child Left Behind was being rolled out. So, you'd hear stories about like basically people at these desks just with their head in their hand saying, some anonymous person came into my classroom while I was teaching with a clipboard and didn't say anything and just checked things off and then walked out. And I was like, that sounds terrible. That sounds so impersonal to be, I really, in a lot of ways, I really feel for teachers. And yes, I mean, they were schooled like the rest of us. And the outcome for many of them is, a kind of obedience to what directives come down from above and a kind of conformity, to each other. But when they finally had that space to like express how unhappy they were with their environments, really pushed me away from like this pursuit of wanting to go and teach in public school. So I went in a private school direction. And then around this time, I'm being exposed to new ideas, new voices, new critics of the school system, people like John Kozel, John Holt, John Taylor Gatto. And that really gets my gears turning, as now I'm working in like these high pressure academic environments. This is after I left classroom teaching. So we're like 2006. I was just working for this tutoring company in the greater Boston area, and seeing the pressures that are on these, keeping up with the Joneses kind of families in these wealthy, overachieving areas around the city.
Right.
And everything there, I think, started to form more like I had been making this collage of all of the bad feelings that I had been having in my profession, going back maybe like right to the beginning. And that, I think, is where I started to like maybe pull in some of my own experiences from like, what was this like when I was a kid? So it was like, I don't know, 2005, 2006, 2007, around there, that I really started to recognize problems and ask questions and get at least curious about what solutions might exist or what alternatives might exist.
Yeah. I love hearing kind of that process. And I think a lot of people have experienced much of that initial, those moments, those touch points where it just doesn't really sit right. And you're kind of questioning like, well, what is this? Why, and for me, like, I would literally look around the room and wonder, where's the fellow, I wouldn't say disgust, but the fellow discomfort with what's going on. Like, I'd see other teachers witnessing some of these same things, and they would all just kind of be going along with it. And I think, is it just me? Like, am I the problem? Did I just not think this through in the right way? And if I just adjust my perspective, then it does all make sense and it is all okay. And so when you connect with others, and especially, you're talking about like connecting with ideas of others who are offering alternatives and offering, some critiques, it is somewhat vindicating as well, because we all have these moments where we sense it, but to have someone else put it into words, it's kind of like, yes, oh, okay, so it's not just me. I didn't just have a brain glitch. There was a glitch in the matrix for a moment where I could see through all of this. And there's more to see if I open my mind up, if I'm willing to be open to those questions.
Yeah, I think the positive take on that, like when you describe that experience of sitting there going, "Am I the only one?" This phenomenon actually has a name. It reminds me of something. It was called the Ash Conformity experiments, and I think it ran like maybe 50 years ago, where a bunch of people would sit in a room together, and one person would be brought in as a test subject, and everybody else who appeared to be test subjects were actually Confederates, like they were in on the experiment.
Right.
Yeah. And the proctor would show them like pieces of string or like little what are they called? Just sticks. And they would say, which one of these sticks is the longest? And in the beginning, like everyone says the right answer, but over time, the sticks get closer in length and people start saying the wrong answers, and everybody agrees that the wrong answer is right. And eventually, the people are clearly picking the shortest stick as the longest. And the test subject, the only person not in on the experiment, eventually will succumb to the pressure of agreeing with the group. This other idea is a little bit different, where in school, we all have this experience where the teacher goes, "Does anyone have any questions?" And we go, "Yeah, I've got like 6." And then you look around the room and nobody else has their hands up. So you say, "Oh, it must be only me." Well, everybody else is going, "Yeah, I got like 4 or 5 or 6 questions right now." But if nobody else is going to raise their hand, and I think that's the product of these kinds of environments where there is, not a lot of forgiveness. And this is a problem of collectivism, which the schools are definitely very collectivist. There's not a lot of forgiveness for the expression of individual needs or individual identity. Certainly in school, there's a place for it, right? You crack a joke, you are having lunch with friends. It's not like completely dystopian. But the environment that you're subjected to, that we are all subjected to in K through 12 schooling, which lasts, 1 through 12 schooling, 1st through 12th grade, is 15,000 hours. And a lot of that occurs during the most socially formative and intellectually and emotionally formative years of our lives. So the environment itself, I have described before as a kind of bully, like a subtle but persistent kind of bully, where people understand like what the expectations, even implicitly, they understand what the expectations of this environment are, and then they conform to those expectations. So yeah, I mean, it's not odd that we would get to be adults and we would be in these environments as teachers going, yeah, if I'm having all kinds of bad feelings about what's going on here, it must be me, right? It must be something wrong with me. And I described it that way before. I said I basically failed my way to where I was by failing at every job, by failing to obey and conform or not ask questions at every job I had. And I would, I'd get there. I sound like I have oppositional defiant disorder now, but I would get there, and sooner or later, something would start to like gnaw at me, like something doesn't feel right about what we're doing. When I worked at this boarding school, oh boy, was it easy, because I was giving kids, some kids like, I was, for a while, I was the med person. And I was actually a med certified person at the school before I even was a teacher. So I'm giving kids lithium and Seroquel and all these for no noticeable changes in their behavior, other than they're gaining weight, they're becoming more lethargic, they're developing jitters or some other side effect, and then just watching kids be drugged more. And that was like my introduction to that aspect of schooling, where it's not, it's like, okay, this is the best evidence I've seen, the best practical sort of idea that if you're not doing well here, something is clearly wrong with you. This is the best demonstration of that I've seen so far. And this was like really early in my career. Now, I mean, obviously, I worked in a place where there were behavioral, social, emotional problems. but all of the kids were also in mostly state custody, or at least they at least had state involvement in their lives, so they were on Medicaid. And this is a place where kids wind up getting drugged, or when people have to conform to the expectations of some environment like this. Drugs were for a long time, and I'm thinking this still is pretty much the case. That is a first kind of, or near the beginning of interventions to get people in line with the demands of the environment.
Right.
So that was a big wake up for me too.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, because we see so much, and going back to your comment about, even just like having ideas like maladaptive behavior and things like that, it is such a clear representation of why creating the structure first and then expecting the child to conform doesn't work. And creating the problem with creating a structure that has so much rigidity that there can't be structural adaptations for the individual needs of each child. Now, of course, I have a strong homeschool bias. So my response to that is, and that's the great thing about homeschooling, because, you can make so many more adjustments and so much, but I'm curious to hear, because I love how bold you are in, just the name School Sucks Project was brilliant and beautiful. And I love that you went with that. And then in your declarations of like, and I'm butchering the quote, you'll say it better than I can, but like the meaning of it is basically, we're not going to be able to improve the system. So your options are either to try to survive or to escape. Now you say what's the actual quote?
There is no reforming the schools. The options are survival or escape.
There it is. So much more beautiful when you say it. So that concept is, I think, one of the most terrifying ideas that you can introduce to a lot of parents, and of course those who are working within the system, because not only does that challenge the assumption that it's working already, but it challenges the assumption that, well, it's, anything that isn't working is just a matter of adjustment, and we can always improve and get to the point where the system is still the answer. The system will always be the answer. We all need to turn to the system, and that flips it on its head. So I'm curious to hear, how you got to that point, because here you are, you've been through the system yourself. You're now working in, private, but still an element of traditional school setting. How did you get to the point where you realize, like, okay, it's not a matter of making a few tweaks and adjustments and we get back on course. The entire course itself is wrong, and your options are to, become a victim of it, or to actually jump off and figure out a different path?
Sure. Well, I want to start by saying, obviously, we're currently living in a culture where when there is controversy, or when there is awareness of a problem, it's like everybody has to be either put into the group of good and evil
Right.
or smart and stupid, right? And I don't want to, like, the persistence of this problem and the lack of possibility for reform in American public schooling, I don't want to say it's because people are evil or stupid. I like to talk about these things much more in terms of human needs. Like, we're all going through life pursuing needs. And I think whether it's the teachers or the parents, or, even people up above that, the students kind of get sucked into this as well, is there's a need for comfort, there's a need for routine, there's a need for a kind of rhythm in life. And this idea, like, getting parents en masse to face the idea that the place that they are sending their own children 35 to 40 hours a week is dangerous and destructive to their developments as human beings, that is a terribly, terribly difficult sell. Teachers are not going to want to believe that they are participating. There's a lot of storytelling that everybody is doing, and that's why so much emotional and intellectual energy gets sucked into this idea of reform, because what we will take off the table is that we're going in a totally different direction. We're going to do something revolutionary. We're going to change everything. That is going to, more and more people have done that in the last couple of years, especially when a lot of the realities of school and higher ed came home with the pandemic, where parents are watching their kids do school and they're going, what is this? Is that I'm paying for this?
Right.
So, yeah, and obviously, like in this teacher's defense, like everyone's scrambling to make sense of what's going on at the time and adjust to something new. I get that. But they get an idea of the culture, they get an idea of the content, and then that probably starts to raise a lot of questions about the cost. Those are three of the big problems with school: culture, content, and cost.
Sure.
At all levels, right up through graduate school. So I was really optimistic that when things changed in 2020, that more people would start asking questions, and that has been generally true. And we have seen, I think, in the last couple of years, the greatest exodus from public school in since the beginning of public school, as far as I know of, as far as new people moving towards either alternative ed, or private schools, learning pods, homeschooling in one form or another. I really like, one thing that I like to clarify in our business, we got to use the word homeschooling for like search engine optimization purposes.
Right.
But I really like real world education. Like when we
Yes.
say homeschooling, first of all, critics of homeschooling have attached a kind of stigma to it, and that stigma comes with a bunch of imagery of a kid just sitting at home at the kitchen table with all their school books doing homeschooling, and
Right. School at home. Yeah.
Yeah, there's probably some kind of massive religious indoctrination accompanying it.
Right.
And like real world education, learner driven education, self-directed education, these are the ways that I like to talk about, like outside of these concrete building learnings. We have to, even if we need to use it for SEO, we have to let go of talking to people about what we're promoting as homeschooling, I think.
Yeah.
It comes with too much baggage. It comes with too much imagery. But yeah, I think like I'm giving a very, very long answer to your question, but I do think that we haven't gotten to the point, and the last 2 years have definitely been a pretty persuasive test case. Most people will not let go of the idea that this is the way that it needs to be. The more entrenched they are, the more dependent they are, the less likely they are to do that. I'm going to give an extreme example that this is like, Brett, are you about to compare schooling to slavery? Absolutely not, but I'm going to evoke slavery in this example.
Sure.
When the entire southern part of the United States was dependent on slavery, and they knew the institution of slavery was coming to an end, that the world was becoming more enlightened, that popular support even for slavery in the South, where most people didn't actually own slaves, was fading, they went into a real kind of desperation mode, and they actually recruited this doctor, I think his name was Samuel Cartwright, to come up with a disease called drapetomania. And drapetomania was a condition that slaves were stricken with that made them want to run away from all of the benefits of captivity. So this is how far the human mind will go to maintain something if it is dependent, to maintain the existence of something if they are comfortable with that existence, or if they are dependent on its existence. So does drapetomania have, maybe some modern forms as far as pathologizing people who are rebelling against injustice or captivity? Do some of these things even exist in school? Sure. But there isn't. I want to be very, very clear, because you have to be very, very clear in this world today about these things. I'm not making a strong connection between school and slavery. I'm saying that this is what the human mind will do to defend the existence of an institution that the human outside that mind needs or feels like they need to survive.
Right. And I would take it a step further, just speaking from my own experience, that layered with the actual proactive measures taken by the systems and institutions of power that really set everything in motion, creates a situation where even if you do speak up, if you're able to question, if you're able to kind of shake loose of that, you're immediately held up as an enemy, rather than you're valued as maybe, oh, well, maybe you have merit, maybe you don't. Let's think about the idea. And the most practical application or representation that I can point out with this is with the existence of unions. So I was, first year teacher, very much not interested in traditional approach to schooling. I ended up teaching kindergarten my first year. Everything about the school that I was at was just like classic issues with the overcrowded school systems. I had 34 kids, only 4 of them spoke English. I had 9 4-year-olds at the start of the year. I had no aid, just so many challenges. And so my whole focus was just like, well, how can I actually help these kids? And like emotionally, how can I help them adjust to schooling? How can I help them learn? Like all these different things. And I remember one of my teammates happened to be the union rep at the site. And she was talking to me. She's like, well, you need to join the union. And I said, well, I have no interest in joining the union. I'm here for the kids. I don't answer to anybody. She's like, no, the union is how we have power. And I said, well, what power do we need? It's like, oh, well, we, get better pay or we get better conditions. And I said, well, what does the union do for the students? And really, she couldn't give any answer other than, oh, well, secondary, benefits. And then I said, well, do I have to, I don't want to have to pay union dues. I'm first year teacher. My wife and I are trying to have our first kid. She said, oh no, you're paying dues no matter what. And so it turned out that, number one, they were taking money out of my paycheck, whether I was a member of the union or not, which is a very telling piece of the puzzle. Mm. And then number two, the whole argument of joining the union was that the union, is a voice of the people and represents you. Well, now fast forward, a few years down the road, I still refused to join. I wasn't interested, but a few years down the road, I see like as political, elections are coming up or different, unrest over various bills that are being considered, all the teachers would get these notifications in their box. And this is in California. So it was the AFT, but the California branch of it, which is CFT, California Federation of Teachers. They would put these leaflets in our teacher boxes with every measure that would be on the ballot and how teachers should vote. And so it just started occurring to me, like, we're sold the idea that unions are to give a voice to the people. And I do think that that is the intent for a lot of individuals who join a union. But when you look at the power structure, and I could go on for an hour about this, but I won't, it's very much top-down decision-making. And so the union's leadership decides, well, this is what's in the best interest. This is how we should vote. This is what we should support, et cetera, et cetera. They then give those marching orders to the union members. And even if you question it, which I did, I mean, I happen to have been a Christian conservative, and every measure that they wanted to vote for was, liberal politicians or measures. There's no voice, there's no option to, give any, hey, well, what about me, or what about my needs? And so it became very clear, like, the union is not for the individual. The union is to use the individual for usurping power as a whole. And I started digging in, and it's like, the funding, you just follow the funding, and you can so clearly see, politicians are donating the money. The union is throwing their support behind the politicians. It is all a very well-oiled machine to gain power. And so I'm returning your long answer for my own long comment, but it's this very subtle difference between individuals coming together and saying, yes, we think this is best, versus this is what's been created, and if you don't like it, get lost, and there's no room for you to question it, criticize it, or even refuse to financially support it. Like, if you're at all involved, you are a part of it, like it or not.
Yeah, so it's a kind of place to catch and corral people and then get them to act in a unidirectional way.
Right.
And we have examples of this in society everywhere. So to your point, there was a person who ran one of the teachers' unions in the 1970s. His name was Albert Schenker. The quote that I remember of his was, "When students start paying union dues, that's when I'll start representing the interests of school children." Now, lots of quotes, in our world are alleged. And let's just take that idea though. Maybe he didn't even really say that. Maybe somebody made up that quote to kind of sum up his general sentiments about his job. But that's a man who understands his administrative purpose in a rational way. He does not represent students. He represents the teachers who teach the students. Now, even in that coldly rational assessment of I'm Albert Shanker and this is what I'm here to do, that trickles down to the people on the service providing level as like, well, yeah, we need all of these things that the union gives us, the better pay, the better conditions, so we can serve the children better. It's a very, very easy argument to make, but it's kind of like once you start looking, I mean, forget it. Once you start looking at how money changes hands around the schools at all levels, where the money comes from, where it goes, it becomes extremely hard to believe in any kind of like genuine interest in children related to this system. But teachers get into these places, into these positions, I think, by and large, for good intentions. You know, my mom actually, she said, well, look, I graduated from high school in, what was it, 1967. They told me I could either be a nurse, a secretary, or a teacher. So I picked teacher, and that's why I did it. I didn't have any lofty intentions about what I was doing. But I think a lot of young people today, actually, no, because we've actually turned a corner into a new kind of world today where people are being sent to teach as a form of activism.
As an activist,
yeah. And that's actually why this became very, very present towards the end of School Sucks, but it's accelerated so much so fast that's why I'm doing, even though I ended School Sucks podcast last year, I'm going back and revisiting some of it now because I know there's so many new people curious about and hungry for alternatives and answers to what they're witnessing in the public schools in K through 12, in K through 6 school right now. But that's a little bit of an aside. When I began the School Sucks project, and certainly when I began my career, I would have felt very confident saying most of the people who enter this profession or currently inhabit this profession are here because they had some kind of idealistic vision about this job. You could see how the quality of teachers would often change as their careers went on. The young and energetic and optimistic and slapping kids high five teacher in the hall at high school versus the guy who would put on the movie and fall asleep. The difference was their age. The difference was their exposure to the system. And I that was one of the things is that I really noticed in my having teachers as a student and working with other teachers, it's wearing adults down just like it's wearing students down. Eventually like that, it's not just like we're schooled in obedience and conformity, but these things are reinforced by that environment. And ultimately the result, like I always say about students, or the 3 hidden lessons of public school are obedience, conformity, and apathy. Obedience, you kind of outsource your individual volition and direction. Conformity, you sort of outsource your identity to a group. And when you do that, when you give up yourself that way, the result is going to be a kind of intellectual, emotional, spiritual, philosophical apathy. Because what do you need what's inside your own head for if you've already relinquished all these other aspects of yourself to other people? Now, those lessons are never put on the chalkboard and taught, but they are 3 of the most persistent lessons in that school environment throughout those 12 years. Those teachers, those adults who are in those environments, I think, they come in well-schooled in the first 2 and the third one, and then they have a career that for too many of them, not all of them, but for too many of them reinforce that. And, by the end, I saw a lot of people who were made extremely apathetic by what they had been exposed to professionally.
Yeah, I see it so much, and especially lately. If Twitter is any indication, which I don't know that we can trust Twitter to be that great of a reflection, but I just left and right see so many teachers who are just done. It's like I see more tweets from accounts that just a few years ago I would follow because of their great energy and enthusiasm toward education. It's like more often than not, I see them talking about, they're going drinking on the weekends to try to recharge to make it through another week. And they were starting to look forward to summer back in January. So I think it's been intensified, and that kind of process has really been accelerated for a lot of teachers. I'm curious, but before we finish up, I would love to hear, because you are at this interesting transition. And I only discovered your work a little while ago. And so I'm still trying to get caught up with, you have so much going on, and so many great podcast episodes that you've done. But I'm curious to hear a little bit about what you're working on now, what's already out there that people can go and find. For those who maybe, this episode is the first that they're really willing to take back, and especially those who maybe, would say, hey, my kid's happy with school. I don't have a problem with school. I'd love to hear, what you have available to help them just open their mind up, open their thinking up. And maybe they won't agree, but if you're willing to consider it, maybe you'll learn a little and gain some more perspective, if nothing else. So what do you have out there?
Sure. Well, okay. So let's talk about School Sucks first. So I actually launched the School Sucks podcast in 2009, and
OG podcasting.
OG podcasting for sure. But if I may toot the School Sucks podcast horn just a little bit, we were certainly ahead of our time on these topics. As far as like what is the damage of the culture and the content of public schooling and college, which we now just call higher indoctrination.
Sure.
So we covered all our bases, but you can only complain about things for so long. And I had so much pent up frustration when I started the podcast in 2009 that the first 100 episodes just really burst out of me. And a lot of it was negative. A lot of it was very critical. And I was young. I was, 31 when I started. And I think with so much stimuli in the external world, I wasn't doing a lot of self-reflection at the time, but I started to realize, well, I'm not very well. I'm doing this and I'm becoming associated with this brand, but I'm not particularly well educated. And what does it mean to be educated? So the podcast quickly turned, and I'm very glad that it did. And I'm very glad or grateful for the influences that I had into like, what would be the properties of genuine self-directed education. So a lot of the show's content actually became, in addition to the problems with school, politically, historically, culturally, philosophically, there's a lot of philosophical problems with the setup of the school system going back 100 and almost 200 years at this point. But revisiting that, going back to that well occasionally, just to kind of poke people with the stick again and say, hey, remember, there's a problem here. Talking a lot about alternative education, whether those be actual institutions or things like homeschooling or unschooling, identifying properties of self-directed education, including critical thinking. And we wound up doing a lot of work on personal development topics like communication and negotiation, organization and time management, physical and emotional health, like all of these things, not taught in school. Entrepreneurship, which nothing is taught about. What could school possibly teach about, entrepreneurship or taking great risks in life? So
I call those the ungoogleable skills, right? It's like school is focused on all this information that if you have a smartphone in 10 years, you're going to be able to access anyway. It's the ungoogleable skills that we really need to be teaching our kids, because that's not something you can just look up one afternoon and have it. It's something you have to actually gain and work through. So
so there's that old cliche, like those who can't do teach. And I was like, well, could I go out and find people who did and then get them to teach, the audience? So my role was like, hey, I'm a guy who's learning and I'll make my learning process public, trying to learn my way out of to de-school myself, basically, to de-school myself as the show goes on. And as the audience, you're invited to watch, and I'll try to be the conduit between the assumed audience member who maybe doesn't know anything about this topic and somebody who's an expert, and I'll try to bridge the gap and just do that on as many topics as possible until I felt like the show had ran its course. I cut it off at 12 years, and I said, hey, that's the length that public school asks, and you can put the two
Right.
side by side and see which one was more respectful of your time and which one gave you a better education. So that was the end of last year. And then with a lot of the controversies in places like Florida around some of this sexual education or gender education, with a lot of the specter of things like critical race theory, that's content, but also the culture of the school during the pandemic. And now I guess maybe we're in a period called post-pandemic or inter-pandemic, like between pandemics, maybe.
Right.
So these safety things that, like, safety is the trump in the 21st century. Safety is the trump card in every argument. We are living in the century of the safe since September 11th, 2001. And, we're looking out at a society basically that has the same top values as, we did in my elementary school, which are safety and fairness. And the schools, obviously are going to latch on to any safety restriction that they can, because, and I don't think this is ever like maybe explicitly stated by many people, but it's a new means of control. It's a new boundary. It's a new rule. Schools love to add rules. Like, why can't you go up this staircase because one time a kid did something dumb in 1994. So there's lots of rules in school like that, and rules are seldom jettisoned. I understand that, like, the schools have loosened up a little bit, but they're never going back to what they were pre-pandemic, no matter what. Like, schools are basically like if you're wondering what schools are like today as an adult on the outside, just go stand in airport security, right? Go stand in a hospital. Go to any university building anywhere in the country, and you can get a feel for the kind of tension that especially with younger people who don't have necessarily the wisdom or the life experience to make sense of this, and they're being acclimated to this as like the only way to be, especially around the wearing masks thing. So there were so many issues kind of converging on 2022 around the schools that I go back and I look at my website, which is schoolsucksproject.com, or I look at the podcast feed and I say, if somebody happens upon this because they have questions, I need to make sure that I give them something clear and comprehensible to go through here, instead of just encountering 12 years of work that, on first glance, especially if we don't speak the same language, like I speak my show in a certain language, and by episode 700, I'm not necessarily talking to the person who's asking their first questions anymore.
Right.
Yeah, I think this was a great marketing lesson that I learned, is that I think it came from this guy, Bruce Barton. I heard about it in this book by Joe Vitale. And it was, we think we're speaking to a crowd, but we're actually speaking to a parade. And what that means is, like, if we build a brand and if we have an audience, we start talking to them, and we talk and we talk and we talk, and time goes on, and we talk like we're always like, you guys remember when I said this in 2012, but what's actually standing in front of you, or what's actually in front of you, is a parade where there's always new people going by. And the purpose might be the same, the direction might be the same, but the idea that the assumption that you're always talking to the same group of people is, at least from like a marketing and promotion standpoint, a bad one. And from an education standpoint, to just be like, oh, you guys, I don't want to go back into this thing that we talked about that time. Don't be afraid to repeat yourself. So now what I'm doing is I'm repeating myself, I think, in the best way that I know how, which is I spent like a considerable amount of time in April going through our entire archive. There's probably 800 episodes of School Sucks, averaging a little over an hour in length. And I said, I'm going to collect the best 50 if they, kind of match this criteria of the sound quality is good enough and they're important enough to the current moment. So then I categorize them into the 5 main domains that we cover at schoolsucksproject.com. The first one is the real problems with school. So I did 10 episodes on that. Maybe I got stuck on that for for a little too long and maybe demoralize some of the people who started listening. But tomorrow I'm starting the second section of 10 episodes about leaving institutional schooling and finding educational alternatives. The 10 episodes that follow that will be about the properties of self-directed learning and critical thinking. The 10 that follow that will be topics in personal development. And the 10 that follow that became a subject that became one of our favorite things to do at School Sucks, which was information and media literacy. We did lots of shows about deconstructing media narratives and finding logical fallacies. So these are the 50 shows composed of these 5 categories, 10 shows each. And at the end, I'm hoping that people who are discovering this now will have what appears to be a kind of curriculum. These are the problems with school. These are the alternatives. And these are the properties of a genuine self-directed education. And in what might wind up to be 60 to 75 hours total, that's what you can get. And then if you want more School Sucks of like hundreds of archived episodes, there's ways to get them. But right now, let's just, if you've got questions and your concerns and curiosities are urgent, let's start with this. Let's go through this and then we'll explore. So that's what I'm working on.
That's so great. And that's, I mean, I think what a lot of people miss is, and certainly when you're starting out, when you're rebelling against or pulling your kids out of traditional school settings, the first thing everyone wants is, well, what do I do? And so it's easier to grab a hold of a prepackaged curriculum that gives you a page, per day or some pages per subject. And there's a certain like validation that a lot of parents feel of, hey, at least I'm doing this. And a lot of other parents are doing it. So it must have merit, must have value. And I don't see any issue with that when you're first starting out. Like if that's where you need to start, by all means, go, spend your money or find a free one, preferably, and start somewhere. But what you're describing is exactly what most parents need to be willing to do. And that is to transform their own assumptions, question their own biases, challenge their own assumptions, and let it become an expansion of your own education before you approach your child's education. Because the moment we decide, okay, well, I'm going to guide my child's learning, you have to acknowledge that you're carrying with you so many pieces of your own experience, your own environment that you were raised in. And until you're willing to like take a hard look at that and really expand your understanding, the likelihood of you passing on, even without knowing, some of your own weaknesses and unnecessary biases and all of these things, they just increase exponentially. So I love that you approach it in a way of, principles, ideas, concepts, and it's not, oh, do this. Like, here's your 170 page guide that you just follow verbatim, word per word, and that this is how you teach your kids. This is how you change your approach, your mindset. And when your mindset has changed, the entire world is open up to you. Like, it's not, oh, now I know how to teach 7th grade math. It's, wow, now I know what learning can look like, which is powerful.
Absolutely. I am always shocked and never surprised with the boxes people put themselves in to think about things in this world, and how much is being neglected as far as possibility. It's so true in politics. Like, I cannot even watch the discourse, if you want to call it that, that's happening in the world right now around so many issues. Things are so polarized, and just so much opportunity is being ignored. And I'm really trying to focus in on somebody who is ready to be intentional about this exploration and about, the education of their own children. I totally understand, like, just give me a curriculum. Like, I'll take my kids out of school and just give me a curriculum. Like, no shame. Absolutely not. But, you are still going to live in a schooled society. Your children are still going to be around other people's children who are schooled. Those parents of those other children have not deschooled themselves. They have not raised their awareness in any of these issues. So the broader perspective that you can come at this whole thing with, I think the better served you are. in the service of your own children. So that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to go big picture. I have a lot of guests that if I put them, like, people will hear guests in this 50 episode run of the Essential School Sucks, that if I put them in the same room, they'd be fighting with each other. But I can integrate their voices in a way like, hey, we are seeking something around the common awareness of a problem. And, it's kind of like, take what you need, leave the rest behind. But I'm trying now to streamline it into, I think, the things that align with most people's needs if they're waking up to the destructive nature of public schooling and the wasteful nature of college and higher ed right now. So that's what I'm working on.
And if it was ever needed, it is needed now. It was needed back when you started it, and the increased awareness and willingness for people to see how it's needed is, your timing couldn't be better. Where can people find you? I feel like we could have talked for another 4 hours, but I know you've got a busy day. Where those who want to keep up with you and continue to access the things that you're doing and the awareness that you're raising, where can people find you?
Sure. Well, I would say let's start nice and simple, and people can just subscribe to the podcast at schoolsucks.fireside.fm. I won't even send you to our website, which is schoolsucksproject.com, but just save that idea for later. You can just start with the Essential School Sucks. And the one other recommendation is YouTube. My YouTube channel is just called it's my name, Brett Veinotte. And I have a video playlist there called The Underground History of American Education, which is based on a book by one of not only the great educators, but the great school critics of all time. His name is John Taylor Gatto. Mm-hmm. And I produced a series of videos just using excerpts from this book, this big book. It looks like a college textbook, which is kind of funny. But right. It tells the story of how the schools got up to the condition they were in around the time maybe people our age were finishing college, right?
Right.
So 20 years ago. And he wasn't too prolific in the last 10 years of his life. He died in 2018. But Gatto is one of the most influential figures in my entire career in this work that I do. He was a huge part of my wake up when I was still working with students in a variety of different jobs. And if people want to just gain some awareness of the problem, find this video playlist. There's 15 videos in the playlist. They're all short and fairly shareable. And I will say, very, very powerful, largely thanks to John's writing. It's called The Underground History of American Education. And it's on YouTube. So the podcast and those videos, and that's all I will ask for people right now.
Fantastic. And I'll link both of those in the show notes as well. So if you're listening to this on anywhere, actually, because it'll pop up on all of them, go ahead and scroll down. You can click directly to. Just to give a quick shout out to your ability. You, aside from being a brilliant thinker, you're a very gifted content creator. So for those who are interested and are worried, well, he just said it was a big, thick book and he's reading it. Is it going to be boring? Well, by now, anyone who's listening knows that your speaking voice is very pleasant, but your approach to it and the creation of these videos, hats off. It's very well done, high quality, high caliber of editing, and they're so enjoyable. I only have discovered recently, and I wish that I had more time to just binge because it's just so well done. So hats off to you for doing that.
Thank you so much for saying that. I really appreciate that. The idea when we started that project in 2013, my friend had made a documentary called The Ultimate History Lesson, where he just sat and interviewed John for an entire weekend and then turned it into a 5-hour documentary film. And when it was done, we were like, everybody's got to see this, but it's a 5-hour documentary film where an old man just sits there and talks. So it's not going to, like, in today's media environment, it's not going to like shoot to the top of everybody's head, right, even though it is profound information. Yeah. So in 2013, I said to him, his name was Richard Grove. He had a whole team of people working on this. I said, what if I cut videos that felt like movie trailers, or at least like movie trail, not like how a movie trailer feels compared to like the movie trailer for Iron Man, but compared to like how a documentary feels, this will have more of like the energy and pace of a movie trailer. So that was actually the intention of the project. So it's not just somebody sitting there reading. Hey, everybody, go check it out for yourself. I think I've said enough. I highly recommend it, and I appreciate your compliment, but it's really John's writing that drives those videos.
Sure.
So,
Yeah.
hey,
Full of great concepts.
Can we should do this again? I'd be happy to come back and talk more with you anytime.
Yes, absolutely. And I really appreciate your time, and thank you sincerely for all the work that you have already done, and for not just walking away from it and saying, hey, we had a good run with the podcast. I'm over it now. I'm going to move on, because like I said, if ever there was a time when this is needed, it's now. And I think there is so much more of an awakening happening, and you're there to perfectly positioned to help guide those of us who are willing to find some of that critique, some of those alternatives. And I love that you have acknowledged, even in yourself, and I think we all have this, it starts as a dissatisfaction and almost like a lament, but it leads to discovering so much more of what's out there. And so thank you for following that through, for letting us be part of that journey. And I'm so excited to see what's yet to come. I think that, you've just scratched the surface with the influence that you're going to be able to have. So thanks again for coming on the show and for everything you do.
Thank you so much, Todd. I appreciate it.
When daddy was not around, but I made my peace with him. There ain't no use in stressing. So mama gave us everything, brother, we're blessed in this life.
That was Brett Veinotte, educator, media creator, and liberator. If you like what you heard today, please take a moment to give our podcast a positive rating and review to grow our audience. And be sure to share it with the other parents and educators in your life. If you want to become a better homeschool educator, head over to homesschooladvantage.com and check out our free resources, or consider becoming a member to unlock your access to the most comprehensive training available for homeschool parents. You can join the conversation by connecting with me on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at Todd K. Michael, Facebook and YouTube, Homeschool Advantage, and at homesschooladvantage.com. Links to all in the show notes. Thank you for joining us. Bye, everybody.
If it wasn't for all of y'all, if it wasn't for all of y'all, wasn't for all of y'all, if it wasn't for all of y'all,